Welcome to Business Today Television. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching Easynomics. This special episode from the International Media Center at the G20 venue, just near the Bharat Mandapam, which we can't show you in this frame, but hopefully we'll get that to you later. And we are kicking off our coverage of the big issues, the economic and the finance sector issues as far as the G20 is concerned. And with me, three guests: Sourav Majumdar, the editor of Business Today, who is joining us from Mumbai; Mr. Mukesh Aghi, the president and CEO of the USISPF, live with us from Washington. Good morning to you, Mukesh. Thank you for your time with us. And former diplomat and one of the most credible voices on matters like this, Ashok Sajjanhar, a former ambassador. Welcome to the show. But before I go to my guests, let's play out for you viewers what was said by the G20 Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh Kant, as far as what to expect from this entire event is concerned. Let's play that bite out first.
We started our presidency on which the Foreign Secretary will talk about, with a meeting of the Voice of the Global South. We got the perspective of 125 leaders, and then we remained focused on the perspective of the Global South and the requirements of the developing countries. And the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration, which many of you will see post the summit, you will see it as a voice of the Global South and the developing countries. No document in the world would have such a strong voice for the Global South and the developing countries as the New Delhi Leaders' Declaration. And therefore, the Prime Minister's vision of India's G20 presidency being a very inclusive presidency has been our aim. There's been a huge scale and reach of India's presidency.
The focus and the vision of India G20 presidency has been to bring focus to the global discourse, to issues which make a difference to people's lives, lead to actionable, decidable, sustainable and inclusive growth, and empower the global growth. Keeping that vision in mind, the priorities which were set and endorsed by finance ministers and governors in February in their first meeting in Bengaluru. Some of them were how to strengthen multilateral development banks for challenges of 21st century. Similar manner, how to support a strong, sustainable, balanced and inclusive growth in the midst of the current challenges which the world is facing. In the same way, how to manage the debt vulnerabilities which several countries are facing. Yet another priorities was that how the technology can be used for financial inclusion, for productivity gains, for efficiency, for private sector. Similarly, how the new potentials of technology, such as blockchain or crypto, can be beneficial, and yet how to build a policy discourse, the policy approaches, and what set of regulation building consensus around that.
Mr. Sajjanhar, I want to begin with you first and ask you to explain to our viewers what is Amitabh Kant and the DEA Secretary hinting towards in terms of the likely outcomes. We just played out a brief snippet, but they held a detailed press conference on what to expect from the summit.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on your show. You know what I think basically Amitabh Kant and the Secretary DA were sharing with the media was, what are the basic fundamental issues that they have been dealing with over the last 9 months or so. The world has been facing a large number of challenges. As Amitabh Kant said, we started with the COVID-19, the lingering impact of the COVID-19. We've had the supply chain disruptions that took place, the impact on the health of most countries, on the economies of most countries, as far as the social structures and systems of most countries are concerned. Some have been able to recover, but as far as developing countries are concerned, they are still reeling under the impact of the COVID-19. And, after that, we've had the other black swan event, the double whammy of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, the conflict might be taking place in a small area, so to say, in Europe, but its ramifications, implications, and impact has been felt globally. We have seen shortages of, particularly of food items, because both Russia and Ukraine are very significant producers and exporters of grain, also of fertilizers. And of course, Europe has stopped importing any energy, gas or oil, or rather very significantly reduced its offtake from Russia. So the total energy available in the global markets, that has come down very significantly. So how do you deal with that? Then there are issues of debt, of increasing debt. And while all these issues have been felt by most countries in the world, but the most vulnerable have been the fragile economies of the developing countries. So we've been focusing on that. In addition to that, we've seen inflation has gone up. And when inflation goes up, then in developed countries, the interest rates are hiked. And that results in further bringing down production, bringing down manufacturing.
Right.
So these are all the problems that the world has been facing. And India has tried to deal with all these issues. And what he suggested, there have been bits and pieces of this coming out, as the secretary said after the first meeting of the finance ministers and central bank governors, as the foreign minister, meeting took place in Goa, the development ministers meeting took place in Varanasi. So we've had some indication of what has been discussed and what are the outcome.
Right.
I'm not going through all the others like climate change, climate finance, but those are also
Of
very,
course,
very
and
important. We'll see the results.
We'll come to that, Ambassador. Mukesh Aghi, you are in Washington. Tell us how the entire effort that India has put in behind this G20 presidency, and it's clearly been a people's presidency, and Prime Minister Narendra Modi gave his first interview on the G20 to Business Today, the Business Today multiverse, and that was well over 3 weeks ago, a complete edition, and another one, in fact, devoted entirely to that. So viewers, go and pick up your copies. But Mukesh Aghi, how does Washington, how does the United States, and especially the business community, look at the G20 in India and what it seems to have catalyzed?
Well, from the Washington perspective, especially from a Biden perspective, it's a monumental occasion for India. For the first time, we are seeing almost 40 plus head of states are coming into the country. But more important is it also sends a message that India is going to be a significant player in the global diplomacy. You have to understand, Washington sees G20 from two broad perspectives. One is geopolitical, second is economic. Geopolitical means what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, what's happening with China, its aggressive posture, and how India can basically work with US dealing with China and the Ukraine issue. Economically, they're looking at secure supply chain. As China gets aggressive with US companies, they're looking at alternative, and India becomes not only a place for secure supply chain, but also focus on a emerging market where they will be able to sell their goods. So Washington sees this as an important event. By Russians and Chinese not coming in, it gives a stage for Biden administration and also Prime Minister Modi to set the agenda much more effectively and efficiently. So I think it does not have a damper. I don't see that from that perspective if President Xi does not come in or Putin does not come in.
Before I go to Sourav, Mukesh, a quick follow-up on that point that you made. Explain to our viewers how the impact of what is happening currently with, for example, with Huawei and its latest chipset and its kind of set of alarm bells in the policy establishment in the United States, because the entire US-China trade issues and some of the issues around the semiconductor industry, does that play out favorably for India and its hopes to attract investment, more and more investment as far as semiconductors is concerned, Mukesh Aghi?
Well, when you look at the new product from Huawei, which has almost a 7 nanometer technology, and everybody was surprised with the chip production of that. So they're trying to basically look at it as to, was that made in China or was that made in partnership with other countries? So that's one aspect. But more important is the decision by Chinese government to ban Apple iPhones officially has sent an impact on the Apple stock by almost $200 billion and probably more itself. That also puts pressure on Apple to look at alternative sites. So it will accelerate its production in India. Apple plans to produce over 20 million iPhone 14 and 15 next year. I think that will just accelerate much, much further. But from a chip making perspective, I think it provides an opportunity for US companies and Indian companies to look at and partner basically create a fab in India. And we just saw an announcement from Reliance. They are seriously looking at going into the chip industry also. So I think as the market gets bigger, larger in India, the attraction for people to set up a fab in India becomes much more critical, important, and sends a strong message.
Great perspective, Mukesh, and I'm really glad that you took out the time to be with us here live from Washington. Sourav, we've been speaking about this practically for 3 weeks now in the run-up to the G20, a complete issue, in fact, almost two. Sourav Majumdar dedicated in the magazine to the G20. But in the last 24 hours, and Mukesh Aghi provided that beautiful summary, things seem to be aligning as far as India is concerned and India's potential as a investment destination. Now, I'm not going to call it China plus one, but do you think that the stars, the technology stars, the investment stars are aligning in India's favor?
Well, Siddharth, I think it's clearly India's moment. We called it Prime Minister Narendra Modi's moment as well. And rightly so, I would think, because it's Mr. Modi's presidency of G20 this time, India's presidency, which is actually showing the way in terms of a lot of issues where collaboration is essential. He has made it very particularly clear that collaboration is the way forward, where India then seeks to be, like Mr. Amitabh Kant just outlined a while ago, about being the voice of the global south. But coming to your question about whether India is now, the stars are aligning, if you look at the report which the World Bank has put out about DPI, I think that itself is a very, very big signal, where we have said that the last 6 years, the world progress made in DPI itself is actually equivalent to nearly 5 decades of work, which has happened. So 25% of adults were accessing that, and now it is now moved to 80%. So there are lots of interesting figures in that World Bank document, which actually really talks about how the progress has been made in terms of digital public infrastructure. And why I mentioned DPI in particular is because that is critical to an inclusive world, the inclusive agenda which this G20 seeks to promote in terms of using technology to reach last mile delivery of to the poor, and technology also which can be used by other poorer and developing nations, the global south, to reach benefits to the poorer people. So that I think it's all tying in very well. And as far as India's clout as an investment destination is concerned, I don't think that has been in doubt over the last 5 to 7 years. I think people are understanding that India is the place to do business in. This government and has also tried its best to sort of push manufacturing in a big way by way of PLI and etc. and many other initiatives of that kind. So I think the overall, atmosphere is one of trying to push ease of doing business and being and at a global level being an important catalyst for a new global order, as the Prime Minister told us in his interview with us.
Absolutely. Viewers, that issue and the latest issue very soon, you can go ahead and pick that up from the stands. Mr. Aghi, I'm coming to you because we are literally now just a couple of hours or thereabouts away from a bilateral between US President Mr. Joe Biden and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Apart from that, we also have several big bang bilaterals, viewers, that the Prime Minister has. He has one with the UK Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, on Saturday, with the German Chancellor, with the Italian Prime Minister, with the Japanese Prime Minister, then lunch with France, pull aside with Erdogan, and of course meeting with South Korea and UAE. Mr. Aghi, let's come back to the US-India cooperation. Clearly, it is the defining partnership of this century. It's been in the making for decades now. Where does this partnership stand today? What can we look forward to, both in terms of deals and the overall relationship going forward?
Well, the relationship between India and the US is a very broad and deep relationship, which seems to go up and up. Let's look at it from an economic perspective. The trade is now almost touching $200 billion. And as Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal said, we should target to have a trade of almost $1 trillion between the two countries. When you look at the economies of two countries, India is growing at 7%, almost becoming a $4 trillion economy, will be a $5 trillion economy in the next 2 years. US is growing also substantially. And from a US perspective, it has to look at for alternative sources, because US companies in the last 2 decades have put in almost $1.6 trillion in the Chinese economy. And as they get harassed more and more, they will have to secure the investment, they'll have to secure their supply chain, and they will have to look for alternative market. And India does become that from that perspective. Then when you look at from a people to people, we have around 5 million Indian Americans, the most affluent minority group, the most educated minority group, and one of the most civically involved minority group. We have 2 candidates of Indian American origin running for president. So what we are seeing is the involvement of Indian American in US politics, US economy, is getting larger, stronger, and better itself. So the momentum from that, momentum from geopolitics, momentum from economic relationship will propel this relationship to a much, much higher plateau. So we feel next 10, 20 years, this relationship will continue to grow in a positive manner.
Important points there, and at this stage, let me also welcome in on the show Mr. Anil Trigunayat, former ambassador. Before I go to him, viewers, I'm just kind of going to summarize for you. Some of those graphics have played out, but let's go through them once again. India's share as far as G20 GDP is concerned. Now, this is a different kind of take on the standard data that you see usually. In 1999, India's share in the GDP of these G20 countries was just 1.6%. And 2023, the estimate is 4.1%, going up to 4.8% by 2028. Again, if you look at in terms of the growth numbers, we are talking about very significant numbers with a 2028 estimate of $5.6 trillion. If you look at the trade share, because ultimately the G20 is a forum which is not necessarily only meant for some security issues, although some of those headlines around Russia-Ukraine have dominated the entire year. But it's also a place where some wrinkles do get ironed out, have in the past when it comes to trade. 1999, 0.9% India's trade share in G20, going up to 3% in 2022. And why is the G20 significant? Just to recap, you must have heard a lot of this, but take a look at the data. 85% of global GDP, 75% of global trade, 63% of the world population, 19 of the biggest economies plus the European Union, and we are not counting the African Union, which seems, as of now, to be set on joining it. And of course, the fifth largest being India, with the EU and the US being top number one and top number two trading partners. But Ambassador Trigunayat, I'm coming to you. Explain to our viewers the significance of the African Union joining. It seems that it's almost a certainty. Is that so? And if it were to be, what does it mean for the G20? It actually started off somewhere else, but now seems to be headed in a different direction, sir.
You are absolutely right. You know that when India took over the presidency, and in my view, it has been one of the most difficult presidencies because of the global events that were taking place, whether it was the pandemic or then it was further compounded by the Russia-Ukraine war. It continues to have its shadow cast on the outcome of the current presidency and the future also. The same thing was true that of the Indonesian presidency at the time. But what is most important is that you have to make the best out of the worst scenario. And this is precisely what India has done. India all along has stood for the global south, which is not a geographical entity, but also basically a developing and developed world's congregation. So early on, within 3 weeks of taking over the presidency, Prime Minister decided to talk to the countries of the global south. Exactly what are their requirements? Very often it is presumed what are their problems, and then solutions are found. But in our case, most importantly, India did was that 125 countries were invited. They talked about their issues, their problems, which were, of course, as a result of these wars in which we had nothing to do, but they were vastly impacted by them. And so, therefore, this became the main thing. And then when you are talking of the inclusiveness, when you are talking about the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam or one earth, one family, one future, then it is a very larger canvas that we are looking at. Now, within that, the African Union is a member, consists of about 55 countries, give and take one. And these countries are the future. Africa is the future for the world. There is already, we are seeing, there are certain countries that debt stress in those countries. Many of them are the fastest growing economies. At the same time, many of them are the poorest and the biggest problem. And the youth dividend is going to come from there. So from that perspective also, Africa is extremely important. It cannot remain marginalized. But somebody has to talk about it. And therefore, Prime Minister Modi started writing to all the leaders of the G20 and requesting them to consider it. And fortunately, as of today, we see that there has been a greater convergence of views on admitting African Union as a member, a permanent member, making it as G21 during India's presidency. So I have really full faith that this is something on which nearly every country has agreed. There was a little difference of opinion with the ASEAN and the Australians, I think, but that has been worked out. And I hope that this will go through. Now, this is, why it will go through is because all countries, major countries, have interest in Africa. Because that's your destination, next destination. So that's the reason that we are going to see it. And India becomes a voice in that sense. Plus, of course, you can see the riches, you can see whatever they offer, the markets and everything. So all put together, this will add to the heft and add 55 countries here. Then you have 27 from the European Union, and then you have 19 other countries, and then 8 or 9 countries that India invited. So it becomes the largest grouping in many ways. And then, of course, when we are talking of the reforms of the multilateral institutions, be it WTO, be it multilateral development banks, all these are going to impact and affect and help the global south countries. So I think this has been the major focus of India, and this is what is continuing. And fortunately, the major powers, at least overtly, have been supporting these initiatives.
You're absolutely right, Ambassador. Perhaps we'll at some stage be talking about a G75 and not just a G20. But Sourav, you heard the diplomats on the show, and Mukesh Aghi is also with us. Sourav, what do you think at this stage, according to you, would be the biggest economic finance track takeaway from all that we have heard so far? And very clearly, previous experience, and I've covered a few G20 summits on the ground overseas, expectations and the actual declaration, sometimes there are gaps. But as of now, Sourav, with those caveats, what do you think would be the key biggest takeaway as far as the finance track is concerned?
That's a very important point you raise, Siddharth. I think, given what the entire scenario under which this G20 meeting is happening, the absence of, China and the top leadership of China and Russia, I think there are key takeaways to be had in the finance track, which I think if this G20 can make significant progress on the multilateral development bank reform, I think that would be a very, very big takeaway from this G20 as far as the finance track is concerned. Now, that is significant because there is already one report which has been put out as part of this, and there will be another report in October. But if this, at the end of this summit, if there can be some declaration or some statement of intent about taking that forward, I think that is linked to a lot of other things which we have been discussing over the last few days, including the Global South. Because as Mr. Amitabh Kant said, even at the BT India at 100 summit the other day, 80% of global growth this time from now on is going to come from the Global South. So this, reform of multilateral development banks is critical for allowing the Global South to access finance and also for climate change, the whole gamut of issues. So I think if there is some reform measure which or some forward movement in terms of what the G20 is thinking of in terms of the reform of multilateral banks, I think that is a very, very significant takeaway.
Okay. Mr. Aghi, I'm coming to you. And as I come to you, I want to replay for our viewers some of the source-based information in terms of the Modi-Biden bilateral. Now, clearly, all attention is focused on that. And some of the key points is civil nuclear cooperation, 6 nuclear reactors to be set up in India. The other one is defense cooperation, a GE jet engine deal, Indian acquisition of 31 MQ-9B drones, and the creation of a global hub for repairs in India. Joint aid for Ukraine, and I'll take that point with Ambassador Trigunayat briefly after Mr. Aghi. India, US to extend humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Then H-1B visa, in-country renewal of H-1B visas. Again, very, very important for Indians working in the United States. Then Indian consulates in Seattle and 2 US consulates in Bengaluru and Ahmedabad. Education collaboration, a year-long master's course for Indian students in the United States. And of course, issues affecting the Global South. Mr. Aghi, how significant is this? And is this the full expectation, or are there any surprises that you think are in store?
Well, when you look at the joint statement between President Biden and Prime Minister Modi after the summit in Washington, D.C., there were almost 108 different initiatives between the two countries. It was from people to education, technology. But you have to understand, let's look at the example of GE engine deal. When India starts manufacturing GE engines or jet engines in India, it will be the 4th country in the world manufacturing hot engines. That's significant because as the India's demand for military planes and civilian plane goes up, and you're manufacturing engines locally, which almost constitute 30% of cost of a plane itself, that sends a very, very strong message. But more important is it sends a message from the US also. The Congress 3 days ago basically had no objection to transfer of this critical technology to India itself. So that's important. And then when you look at it from defense side, drones, yes, obviously India is paying for those drones. Some will be assembled in India, they eventually manufactured in India. But that also is significant. You have to go back 20 years ago when India got into the generic drug market. Today, India is producing or providing 30% of the generic drugs to the United States, bringing almost over $100 billion in savings. So when you go forward, I'd like to see that by next 20 years, India will play a very dominant role providing defense equipment and technology to the United States in a very cost-effective manner itself. So what we are seeing is an ecosystem being built up between US and India trying to collaborate on the manufacturing side. Your questions on H-1B, that's a serious issue because we have almost 1.2 million Indians waiting to get their green card, and the waiting time is going into decades itself. And that's not acceptable. But that's not just a Biden administration issue. That's a congressional legislative issue, and that needs to be hammered out. As you talk about areas of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and then defense collaboration and joint exercises, what we're seeing is a very comprehensive partnership taking place all the way from geopolitics to economic to people, from technology transfer. So we expect this to keep on continuing with the momentum in the next 10 to 20 years itself.
That's a very nice summary. Ambassador, you heard Mukesh Aghi and all the key points that we've just played out. What's your top pick? And I actually want you to explain if at all this bit about humanitarian aid being extended to Ukraine, is there something new in it? Does it kind of hint towards a realignment? Because there was a bit of a blowback that India faced with regard to the stance that we took, especially on the purchase of Russian oil, for example, sir.
Well, I fully agree on the points that were made by Mr. Aghi. I mean, it is a globally comprehensive strategic partnership that we had with the United States. It is also a partnership of choice, as well as a partnership of compulsion for the United States. Because of the strategic the equations that are emerging today between China and USA. So India has to make the best of it at the moment. As you know, in foreign policy, there are no permanent friends or enemies. So until 71, USA was on the other side. From 91 onwards, they started changing tracks, and now we have a USA is our closest partner in many ways. And therefore, we need to make the best out of it at the moment. As far as question of, the Ukraine war is concerned, India had taken a principled position. Very often it is just shortchanged into that India wanted, has defense equipments from Russia or some oil and whatnot is what is defining feature. But that is not true, frankly. India has always tried to take a position which is in its own favor and in the global peace and security. And that's why it's extremely important to understand it is in that dimension. It is not simply opportunistic. Because otherwise, you have had such great relations with all Quad countries, all Western countries. Everybody came to India. You know that there were 23, 24 ministers and prime ministers. Everybody came to India to persuade India to condemn Russia. But what is happening now, another point that people forget about, is that USA, even though it has put the sanctions or the Western countries on Russia, they are still buying uranium, they are buying various equipments and other critical minerals from there. And even India has emerged as the largest diesel provider to the United States during this period. And the most of it is coming from Russia and being processed in India and being sent to Europe and America. So, we need to look at it from the politics apart, it's media semantics apart, but the fact remains is that everybody wants this war to end, number one. Number two, as far as Ukraine is concerned, USA was very keen that during the G20, India should invite Zelensky and let them talk and all that, which India said that we had already decided on this thing, and we don't want to. What India has tried to do is from day one, if you remember, as far as humanitarian assistance is concerned, we have been providing from day one the humanitarian assistance. On the humanitarian catastrophe, India has always spoken out in favor. India has spoken in favor of the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine all along. That has been there very much. Fact remains is that you can just condemn a country and not have any possibility of bringing close to it. The idea is to close this chapter of war which is going on, which is affecting the whole world. And that's what I think. So, in this particular thing, it might be, I would say that both might coordinate their activities as far as humanitarian relief is concerned. But at the same time, I don't expect, because see, the Americans have put billions of dollars into arms, ammunition, and other things into the country in Ukraine, and this is not leading to a very great difference at the moment. So I think that they will be looking at India's contribution in this, how it can be done. It may have a bit of a, I would say, a semantics, but no change in position.
Okay. Well, Saurav, the last question to you as we wrap up this element of our programming right now. You know, you've tracked Indian business, Indian companies for virtually decades now. One of the key things that strikes us is the deep relationships that Indian companies and US companies have. One of the latest announcements is Reliance Industries partnership, literally as we are speaking just maybe an hour ago, Saurav, with one of the most valuable tech companies in the world, chip makers in the world, and that's something that is obviously going to excite the markets as far as Reliance is concerned. But your takeaway as far as the possibilities, future possibilities of further cooperation between Indian companies and US companies in the overall diplomatic framework, Sourav Majumdar.
No, that's absolutely right, Siddharth. I think over decades, Indian companies have had deep relationships with stakeholders from the United States, and I think today's announcement on NVIDIA itself is a very, very big one, with one of the biggest companies in India and one of the biggest companies in the world as well. So I think that itself is proof that how deep it goes. But across the sectors, if you look at, I think there was a discussion earlier in this show about chip making. I think there is a possibility there of foreign investors coming in. There is a possibility of Elon Musk investing in this country. So there is a whole lot of entire ecosystem which American companies and Indian companies can collaborate around. And I think this whole point about India making it easier for businesses to set up shop in India, I think that is something which I think businesses in India as well as in the US, and I'm sure the ambassadors will agree, have been really pretty focused and pretty bullish about. And I think the government here itself is very focused that we need to welcome foreign investments, particularly from the US. And Indian relationship with the US is very, very strong, getting stronger every time. And this is borne out and evidenced by the fact that President Biden is here as we speak. So I think these are things which the companies in India, the biggest companies, and are very, very mindful about. And I think that discussion across corporations, both in India and overseas and in the US, will continue.
All right, Sourav Majumdar, that was a good summary. And as we leave you on the show, viewers, remember, as far as chips are concerned, there are two separate proposals, including from Foxconn. And given the origins of Foxconn, I just want to bring it to everyone's attention, viewers, that diplomacy goes hand in hand with high-tech investments. And a guest on an earlier show had said that this is the time where India's technology-led diplomacy is also being recognized through the DPI. And perhaps with some of these inbound investments as they fructify, the hard reality of high-tech investments, manufacturing setups in India will come true. And that will also be one of the legacies of all the effort that India has put in as far as this G20 presidency is concerned. I want to thank all my guests for their time on the show, and you, the viewer. We'll be back with more. Until then, goodbye. Welcome. I'm Siddharth Zarabi and you're watching this special business round.